Well, for some analysis on what these hikes in the airlines in South Africa mean and how they've come about, we're now joined by a publisher and editor of the SA Flyer magazine and aviation analyst, Dr. Guy Leitch. Guy, thanks very much indeed for joining us. We were chatting a little bit during the break, and I was just wondering, a lot of planes were parked because of COVID-19. Isn't it just a question of dusting them off and getting them back in the air? Why are there no seats?
Yeah, hi Peter, and nice to be with you. Well, the unfortunate reality in South Africa is that most of the major airlines, especially the low-cost carriers, had leased almost all their fleets, all their aircraft. And as these aircraft sat on the ground, they were eventually returned to the lessors. In fact, just this past week, we've seen yet another Mango aircraft having been returned to its lessor to be sold on to somewhere else. So there really isn't a aircraft availability for domestic flights. And in fact, it's one of the reasons SAA has been holding back, simply because they do not have a fleet at all that is suitable for the operations that they're trying to do. But perhaps one of the things that we need to look at is the quest towards finding a new level, the new norm, if you like, post-COVID. Yes, as your introduction mentioned, we've seen a lot of upward pressure on prices. And that obviously, as prices go up, then demand will drop. And ultimately, I expect us to find a new equilibrium in the early part of next year, in about sort of 6 months or so time. I'm afraid that we're going to continue to see a shortage of supply in terms of seats, and this unprecedented demand which the travel agents were talking about. And then, of course, we get into our own peak period, our own summer holiday period. So it's not going to be much before January, February that we see some sort of stability or equilibrium between supply and demand.
Are there less players as well? Because part of competition is having more players in the marketplace. And with less players, you don't tend to see those prices moving as quickly. Very
much so. You know, we've seen obviously the big loss was Comair with its two brands, British Airways and Kulula, and those took 40% of the available seats out of the market. But we mustn't forget Mango as well as out of the market, and of course SA Express. So yes, there's been in South Africa a particularly powerful drop in seat availability. But it also needs to be noted that the South African market has always been characterized by its intense competition. It's why that we've had such a high fatality rate amongst airlines, or rather mortality rate amongst airlines. Yeah. That very few, so few have managed to survive. Think back to Velvet Sky one time and so on. And it's because the market has been incredibly hard to make money in. As we know, airlines are a very capital-intensive industry, and yet the margins are really paper thin. So we're seeing airlines trying to rebuild their balance sheet at this particular stage. They really got absolutely mauled by COVID and by the long grounding, and yet they still had all these costs eating into their balance sheets, into their financial reserves. So the airlines are building up. And hopefully, you know, we're seeing already a rapid increase in capacity from the survivors. Fly South Air is in the process of taking delivery of 5 new aircraft, 183-seater Boeing 737-800s. Lift is continuously, slowly, steadily growing its fleet of Airbus A320s. And even more interesting from an analyst point of view is that we're seeing that Airlink and Semair are stepping into the gap, not just as regional airlines to step into the gap left by SA Express, but also operating on the very competitive so-called golden triangle of Joburg, Cape Town, Durban. That's all part of, obviously, their network responsibilities in terms of feeding their network partners. But we're seeing a lot of new capacity arriving into the market, and hopefully, too, SAA will start flying a little bit more to provide a full service offering in the domestic market.
Just before we started chatting, that story talked about being taken by surprise. So talking about the survivors, I suppose there's no model that they could have worked with in terms of saying, by month 4, by month 5, we need X number of planes, we need to have built up a fleet of this capacity. Has that been the challenge as well? You just don't know what the future is, so you can't overcommit.
Very much so. You know, the airlines have been, the ones that have survived have been very cautious about getting back into the sky. In fact, one of the reasons behind the downfall of Comair was that it got back into the air just perhaps a little bit quickly. And yes, but all the major travel organizations such as IATA have been taken by surprise by how much pent-up demand there has been for travel. So people have been prepared to put up with these unconscionable delays in airports like Schiphol or Heathrow, where they've had to check in 5 hours before the flight if they have any chance of catching that flight. The big the surprise too was that the crunch point happened at the really lower end of the service scale amongst, for instance, ground handlers and so on, and not at the top end, which is where the pilots are. A lot of people knew that as many as 30% of the pilots have left the industry, and they thought that the big crunch was going to be a pilot shortage. It turns out to be a logistics problem, as I said, at ground handling and in check-in services and those sort of areas that have caused the problems that the unprecedented demand has created.
There were issues in SAA in particular before COVID-19, and so it's easy sometimes to look at COVID-19 as a trauma for everybody, but there were issues beforehand, and I just wonder, COVID is now sort of being managed. Are those issues gone, or is there still more pain for our national carrier?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because there are strong signs coming through that SAA is asking for another 3.5 billion rand in terms of the next budget. And this despite, I've just lost the line, this despite promises by both SAA itself and Minister Pravin Gordhan that they will not come back to ask for any more money. So there is a lot of pain coming, because SAA's overhead structure is way out of alignment with its actual number of aircrafts and routes being flown. Hopefully it'll build up sooner rather than later to meet that. But I'm afraid it looks like we've got a lot of pain coming down the line with SAA still. And not only that, but they're going to have to come back sooner or later and replace the fleet, which I mentioned earlier. Their long-haul fleet is completely inappropriate with these old dinosaur 4-engined Airbus A340s. And that's going to cost somebody another 30 billion rand. Yes, they can lease them. But then again, you end up with the problems, as we saw or discussed earlier, where the lessors can just take their aircraft back, in bad times. So there's a balance to be had here. And I have to say that I remain very worried about the future of SAA, or rather the future of SAA's ability to not require tax funding.
All right, not just SAA. Right now, I'm sure you're worried about Eskom as well. Guy, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much indeed.